We got more doom and gloom for liberal policies. State Farm Insurance is threatening to leave California. Why? Well, California has a stupid law that says insurance companies can't adjust their rates without a government panel's approval. I mean, pretty much the definition of socialism, but whatevs. So State Farm has been losing money in California for the last 10 years, unable to cover their payouts with their in-state premiums due to wildfires and other avoidable disasters such as things like forest management, which California refuses to do, that attributes to wildfires. And I have to add that Trump did encourage them to do this his entire presidency. But I'm going to get this out in a minute, but these same wildfires also devastated farming in California in 2020, which claimed massive insurance policies after the damage as well. But under California law, the insurance companies enduring these losses they can't cancel your policy without a reason, so they're stuck by state law. State Farm is paying more for their reinsurance coverage, which is also required by the state law, getting paid less from their customer premiums due to inflation, and paying out more due to increased disasters. I would leave too, but they're stuck. Non-disaster states are subsidizing California. This is the real-world cost of big government control, which is also connected to our manufacturing industry, which is also facing significant problems. One of the oldest companies in America, dating back to the Civil War, John Deere, is about to axe a ton of employees out of Iowa and move those jobs to Mexico. Why? Well, because the cost to manufacture stuff in America in the last 3 years, due to labor unions, environmental groups, stupid regulations, is absolutely astronomical. And because those rising prices, the agriculture industry cannot afford to pay more for the same equipment. So the only option for John Deere is to cut costs so they can sell equipment at cheaper. But let's back up. Why can't the agricultural industry afford to pay more, even outside of California, where their farms weren't burned to the ground? I'll tell you why. Because during Joe Biden's presidency, the cost of everything needed to farm, our food, by the way, has skyrocketed. Let's take something simple like corn. We need more of it. In large part, also due to government regulation. It's been mandated that we add ethanol to our fuel. That little sticker that says E85. What's E85 made out of? Well, it's corn. It's basically moonshine. This has soared in price, which has since come down, but manufacturers are still recouping their losses from that massive spike where they almost doubled. Why did it spike? What does corn require to grow? Lots of nitrogen-based fertilizer. And what's that done? Well, that's nearly doubled at one point. It's still up about 50% over what it was in 2019. And in the off-season, when farmers aren't growing corn, they have to plant things like cover crops like rye and wheat. And guess what they need to do at the end of that season? They need to terminate that crop. And what do you use for that? Glyphosate, Roundup, basically, which has also soared over 300% in costs in the same time period. And to run all those pieces of equipment, you have to burn diesel fuel, which has also increased dramatically. Are you seeing a trend here? So am I surprised that John Deere is selling less tractors? No, not at all, because there's no money to buy it. These are the real-world consequences of big government regulations and mandates. Everything in our economy is connected, from insurance to tractors to fuel, and it all affects you. Here now, global business consultant Hillary Fordwich and public finance economist E.J. Antoni. Hillary, I really don't understand how these Democrats can still, after all this mounting evidence, sit there and tell me that, no, nothing's related to one another.
Oh, no, it totally is. And with regard to those wildfires, for millennia, the native tribes, Carl, they had been using controlled burns. What they referred to actually as good burns. And even Stanford, the Wood Institute there, conducted a survey. They had to do all this research and then took samples, etc. And with controlled burns, there's 64% less likely to be a wildfire if there's a controlled burn. So that's from the actual Stanford Wood Institute. And they also found from the control burns that they undertook that it keeps the soil moister. So this is due to the California regulations of not allowing these wildfires, these controlled wildfires. So you have all this brush underground, you have all the forests. It's literally sparks when anybody when you have too much dry air, and it sparks when anybody happens to light something. And again, for millennia, the native tribes were able to prevent this. That's specifically and purely due to government regulations. That's why they're having more wildfires.
But EJ, from an economic standpoint, you have, anyone who tells me that trickle down economics is not a thing, I'm gonna reread that monologue to them and explain to them, look, if you can't buy tractors, then everything is affected.
Oh, absolutely. We look at inflation a lot of times as something that just affects the consumer, as if these consumer prices just magically rise out of thin air. But the reality is that all of this excess government spending has caused demand to go up for everything. That pushes up not just consumer prices, but wholesale prices, commodity prices, you name it. And so everyone is paying more, consumers and businesses alike. And it's not just us at the grocery store that are getting squeezed, it's the farmer who's trying to bring us that food who's also getting squeezed. That's something really important that people need to remember. Inflation is a hidden tax on everyone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But, Hillary, when we look at these macro things, like an insurance company, I think the largest insurance company in America is that might leave the state, and the state's trying to lock them in with all kinds of new regulations. Like, if I'm not doing business there because I'm not profitable, if you make a law, I'm just not going to be able to, and then I'm going to go bankrupt for the other 49 states.
No, you're absolutely right. You're referring to a state farm, and it's basically like financial prison. The government doesn't understand, and I've always maintained, wouldn't it be wonderful if our politicians actually had to have run a business before they go into government? They don't understand that you can't be just dictated to, that you to have this with your policy and that with your policy. And yes, they were unable to raise their prices when they did have to cover the wildfires, and now they're seeing State Farm in particular is one of the very few left. Allstate has already pulled out, and the other insurers have already pulled out. This is a direct result of those regulations. Ironically, unintended consequences.
Right, but EJ, the other thing too is we always say, like, look, take your bad policies, go live in Florida, go live in Oregon or Washington State or whatever those things. But the problem is now Vermont or Connecticut or my state, which has relatively low natural disasters and lower insurance premiums that haven't gone up in years, are starting to rise because now State Farm has to, because they're locked into California via regulation, now has to subsidize that stupidity over in California. So now 3,000 miles away, I'm screwed.
Carl, you're absolutely right. This is just another example of these bad liberal policies bleeding over into, frankly, conservative states. If you want to know what happens to the nation at large, if the radical left actually gets their way and takes over this country, look at California, because that's where the radical left has already had their way for many years. My goodness, Gavin Newsom turned a $100 billion surplus into a $60 billion deficit, and he did it in a very short period of time. Yeah. So, again, if you want to know what is the radical left's agenda and what will the results actually be of their policies, just look at California.
Yeah, and he wants to be the next presidential candidate. I mean, that for the Democrat Party. Anyway, we got to leave it right there. EJ and Tony, Hillary Fordwich, always a pleasure.
Thank you, Carl.